The painting had no title. It occupied the largest wall in the museum, more than 4 meters wide. A lonely figure stood on the edge of a cliff beneath an endless sky. No face, no clear destination, only a single traveler looking toward the horizon. Every visitor eventually stopped before it. Some remained for seconds, others for nearly an hour. The museum had placed a small wooden bench in front of the painting. It was almost always occupied. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, a young man entered the gallery. He had come to escape another exhausting day at work. Without knowing why, he found himself standing before the enormous canvas. Around him, people whispered their interpretations. An elderly woman smiled softly. "It reminds me of my late husband." A businessman folded his arms. "I see ambition." A university student shook her head. "No, it's clearly about loneliness." A little boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "I think he's looking for home." His father laughed. "I think he's looking for adventure." The young man found it fascinating. Everyone looked at exactly the same painting, yet nobody seemed to be describing the same image. He continued listening. One visitor saw hope. Another saw despair. Someone called it freedom. Someone else called it fear. The painting itself never changed. Only the people standing before it did. He quietly sat on the wooden bench, trying to decide which interpretation was correct. A calm voice beside him interrupted his thoughts. "Interesting." An elderly man sat at the opposite end of the bench. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't looking at the painting. He was watching the visitors. The young man followed his gaze. "What are you looking at?" "The painting." The old man smiled gently. "No, you are looking at the canvas. I am looking at the people." The young man frowned. "Why?" "Because the painting tells me almost nothing." He paused. "But the people tell me everything." Silence settled between them. The old man continued observing the crowd. A woman quietly wiped away tears. A young couple debated what the artist had intended. A photographer searched for the perfect angle. A child simply stared. Each person believed they were discovering the painting. The old man softly shook his head. "They're discovering themselves." The words lingered. The young man looked back at the artwork. "It can't mean all those different things." "Perhaps," the old man replied. "Or perhaps the painting has become a mirror." The young man stared at the enormous canvas again. The traveler still stood alone, unmoving, silent, exactly as before. Yet, somehow, the room now felt completely different. The old man spoke again. "When two people read the same sentence, they often believe they are reading identical words." He smiled faintly. "They're not. They're reading those words through completely different lives." The young man thought about the conversations he had argued over, the relationships that had ended because two people insisted they were seeing the same situation. Perhaps they never had. Perhaps every argument began long before the words were spoken. The old man slowly stood. He walked closer to the painting. Still, he never looked directly at it. Instead, he watched the reflections of the visitors in the polished wooden floor. "My name," he said calmly, "is Friedrich Nietzsche." The gallery remained almost silent. People continued debating the meaning of the painting. None of them realized the most fascinating work of art in the room had never been hanging on the wall. It had been standing in front of it all along. The gallery grew quieter as the afternoon passed. A few visitors left. New ones entered. The painting never changed. Yet the conversations around it changed constantly. The young man looked at Nietzsche. "So, is there no correct interpretation?" Nietzsche smiled. "There may be, but that is not what interests me." The young man frowned. "What interests you?" "The interpreter." They remained seated on the wooden bench. A middle-aged man approached the painting. He stood perfectly still for several minutes. Then he quietly whispered to his wife, "It's about regret." Moments later, a teenage girl stopped before the very same canvas. She smiled. "No, it's about freedom." The young man looked from one visitor to the other. "One of them has to be wrong." Nietzsche gently shook his head. "Perhaps. Or perhaps They are revealing far more about themselves than about the painting. Silence settled between them. The philosopher leaned slightly forward. Imagine placing the same piece of music before a soldier, a widow, and a child. Would they hear the same song? They would hear the same notes. The young man answered, but not the same meaning. Nietzsche nodded. Exactly. The ears receive the same sound. The mind does not. The young man slowly looked back toward the enormous canvas. He began noticing something unexpected. Nobody spent much time studying the brushstrokes, or the colors, or the composition. Instead, they immediately began explaining what the painting meant, almost as though they had arrived carrying the meaning with them. Nietzsche quietly spoke again. Human beings rarely approach the world empty-handed. They carry memories. They carry fears. They carry hopes. They carry disappointments. And then they mistake those things for reality. The sentence echoed through the gallery. The young man remembered an argument with his younger brother years earlier. They had witnessed the exact same conversation at a family gathering. Days later, each described it completely differently. At the time, he had assumed one of them was lying. Now, he wondered whether both had been sincere, simply seeing through different histories. Nietzsche stood and walked slowly toward another painting. It showed nothing more than an empty wooden chair beside an open window. Again, visitors disagreed. One woman called it loneliness. Another called it peace. A retired teacher smiled and whispered, "It reminds me of retirement." A little girl laughed. "It looks like someone's about to come home." The philosopher turned toward the young man. "Do you notice? The paintings have become almost irrelevant. What matters is the invisible world each person brings into the room." The young man felt a strange discomfort. If that's true, how can anyone ever know reality? Nietzsche smiled. A dangerous question. He looked toward the visitors. Most people believe they are searching for truth. He paused. But very often, they are searching for confirmation. The word struck like a quiet thunder. Confirmation, not truth. The young man thought about social media, news, politics, relationships, even his own opinions. How often had he searched for understanding? And how often had he searched for evidence that he was already right? The answer unsettled him. Nietzsche continued, "The greatest prison is not ignorance. It is certainty. Because certainty quietly closes a door through which new understanding might have entered." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The gallery was almost empty now. The traveler in the painting still stood on the cliff, unmoving, silent. Yet the young man realized something remarkable. The painting had not changed once. He had. And perhaps that had been the artist's true masterpiece. Not creating an image that everyone understood, but creating one that revealed the person standing in front of it. The museum announced it would close in 15 minutes. The gallery slowly emptied. The voices faded. The debates ended. One by one, the visitors disappeared into the long marble corridors. At last, only 3 remained. The young man, Nietzsche, and the silent traveler in the painting. The room felt completely different now, without the opinions of others. The painting seemed strangely alive. The young man stood and slowly walked toward the enormous canvas. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then he quietly asked, "What does it mean?" Nietzsche looked at him. "I don't know." The answer startled him. "You don't?" The philosopher smiled. "No, and that is why I like it." Silence settled between them. For centuries, Nietzsche continued, people have searched for paintings that provide answers. I prefer the ones that ask questions. The young man looked again at the lone figure standing on the cliff. He realized something he had never noticed before. The traveler wasn't looking toward the horizon. The traveler was looking beyond the frame, beyond the painting itself, as though inviting whoever stood before it to continue the journey. "It feels different now," the young man whispered. Nietzsche nodded. "Of course. The painting never changed." "You did." Those words echoed through the empty gallery. The young man suddenly thought about his entire life. How many conversations had he misunderstood because he was listening through old wounds? How many people had he judged because they reminded him of someone else? How many opportunities had he rejected because of fears created years before? Perhaps he had rarely experienced reality itself. Perhaps he had mostly experienced his own interpretation of it. The museum lights dimmed slightly. Closing time. A security guard quietly walked through the corridor, reminding the last visitors that the museum was about to close. Nietzsche slowly put on his coat. Before walking away, he stopped beside the painting one final time. Without looking at it, he spoke. Every person believes they are looking through a window. He paused. Very few realize they are looking into a mirror. The young man remained motionless. For the first time, he understood why Nietzsche had spent the entire afternoon watching people instead of staring at the canvas. The painting had never been the lesson. The observers had been. Each visitor believed they had uncovered the artist's message. In truth, they had quietly revealed their own. The philosopher walked toward the gallery exit. Just before disappearing into the corridor, he turned back once. "Be careful." The young man looked up. "Of what?" Nietzsche's expression remained calm. The world rarely deceives us as much as the stories we tell ourselves about it. Another silence. Then he disappeared beyond the doorway. The young man stood alone before the painting. He no longer wanted to know what the artist had intended. A more important question had taken its place. When he looked at the world, when he looked at success, at failure, at love, at strangers, at himself, how much was he truly seeing? And how much was merely a reflection of his own fears, hopes, memories, and beliefs? He took one final look at the traveler on the cliff. Then he smiled, not because he had finally understood the painting, but because he had finally begun to question the one person he had trusted without hesitation, the observer, himself.